Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I'd never seen an introduction in graphical form like that. And I would only say that was, whatever goes up comes down. And so, but I appreciate the warm introduction. And, that was sort of my academic background. And I come here as a government bureaucrat today. And so, okay, great. Beautiful. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate the honor. And more so, thank you for getting me out of Washington, because it's sometimes a little stifling out there. And it's really fun to come back to a university and meet with students, which I've met one student in the morning, and just hang out with faculty and talk about science and engineering. And that's the fun part, and I really appreciate that break that I got today. So I'm going to talk about energy. And ARPA-E was formed in 2009, actually 2007, but really launched with dollars behind it in 2009. But I'm going to present to you sort of the background of this agency, but more so what the global challenges are before I go into some of the technologies. So ARPA-E was created as a recommendation by a National Academy's report called Rising Above the Gathering Storm. This is a report that was chaired by Norm Augustine, former chairman and CEO of Lockheed Martin, and had Craig Barrett, who was the CEO of Intel, Stephen Chu, who is now the current Energy Secretary, and many others. And these were sort of the thought leaders of our nation. And the recommendations were about our STEM education system and many other specifics as to they felt that there's a gathering storm coming for the United States, and we need to rise above it. One of the recommendations was the formation of an agency called ARPA-E, which is a DARPA-like agency in the area of energy. And if you go back in the history of DARPA, it was created in 1958 in response to the launch of Sputnik, which was on October 4th, 1957. And at that time, in 1957-58, it was felt that the US was losing its technological lead to the Soviets. And it was felt that we cannot make just incremental improvements in technology, in information, in space, and defense technology, but we need to make some quantum leaps. And it was 1958 when it started, and in the last 50 years, as you know, it has delivered with TCP/IP, which is the foundation for the internet today, stealth technology, and many others, VLSI CAD, et cetera. So a lot of things came out of DARPA. So no pressure on us. We were said, okay, now go do it for energy. So 2009, I was at Berkeley and got a phone call saying that, hey, can you come and run this agency? And I had to think, because I had to resign my tenured position at Berkeley. But nevertheless, so I came to Washington. Have never thought before that I would ever work as a federal employee in Washington. So how do you start a federal agency? There's no instruction manual for it. So I said that, okay, let me do what I suppose many of you would do, is to do this, is to go to the web and say, how to start a federal agency. And if you do that, you get this, how to land a top-paying federal job. And since I took a pay cut to get to Washington, this wasn't quite helpful. But the Gathering Storm Committee was not done with that report in 2006, 2007. It came out with another report in 2010 called Rising Above the Gathering Storm Revisited, the Storm Rapidly Approaching Category 5. And this is a much smaller book with a lot of factoids and quotes, et cetera, about the situation that we are in today, that oftentimes when we're so busy, we don't quite consider how critical a time we are in. And I just want to share with you one quote in this book, which I think describes our times like nothing else. It's by Sir Ernest Rutherford. Gentlemen, we've run out of money. It's time to start thinking. And I can't find anything better describing our current times. So I'm going to share with you how we are thinking about the energy and what we're doing about it. So let me start with oil. Transportation, we have only one fuel that we use, that is oil. And that gives us vulnerability. In the electricity sector, at least we have other options. With transportation, we have one oil. The price of oil is decided by a global market, We do not control the price of oil, and it fluctuates based on demand, supply, and speculation. And we are vulnerable because, as you can see, we became an oil importer in the 1940s, and today we import about slightly more than 50% of the oil, and we pay $1 billion a day for it. And if you just aggregate it, it's almost $400 billion a year, which is a big fraction of a trade deficit. Okay, so this is an economic issue. And it is a national security issue because we are sending our troops to make sure that our supply chains are intact. Okay, so talk about a global problem. This is not just a US problem, but China is in the same boat. It became an oil importer in the 90s, and it did even better than us. They became 50% of the oil consumption, of their oil consumption in a matter of 15 or 20 years. Okay? And so this is a global issue. Other growing economies, India and Germany, Japan, they're all oil importers. We are all in the same boat, both as a national security and an economic security problem. So the question is, what do we do? And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So this is for transportation. We have, the biggest reserves of oil are not where the economies are actually growing. So access to energy, which in the past has led to many conflicts, is an issue out here in the future. Okay, we are vulnerable because there's only one fuel for transportation. On the other hand, if you look at stationary power, electricity, that requires various other sources of electricity generation, the biggest one around the world being coal. And if you look at the coal reserves, the biggest reserves of coal are in Asia, but in country-wise, United States has the biggest reserve of coal, and the other three countries are Russia, China, and India. So at least in the electricity generation, if push comes to shove, we have coal where the economies are growing, and the United States has the biggest reserves of coal. The question is, can we use it responsibly? So if you do that, if nothing changes and we go business as usual, as many of you know, there's a climate problem. And I won't go into the details except to show two charts which are revealing in this way. This is a paper that came out from the Carnegie Institute at Stanford in 2009 called The Velocity of Climate Change. We all know that the CO2 concentrations are increasing, and whether the cause of that is there's perhaps some debate about that, not perhaps in the scientific literature, but amongst the citizenry. There is some perhaps debate. But if there is climate change, there's no question that the CO2 levels are going up. And the question is, what is the velocity? And the velocity is given in kilometers per year as a temporal change, degrees of Celsius per year, and spatial gradients, degrees Celsius per kilometer. If you do that, you get a map. This is about 10 kilometers per year, which is huge, because in a generation, which is about 30 years, the climate would have moved about 300 kilometers. Okay, that's a lot of distance. And so if you look at that, this is 10, 1, et cetera, you find there are some areas where the climate is changing really rapidly. Now, if you consider the climate change out here or somewhere in the Andes, which is fine, but maybe there are not enough people out there. So I went ahead and said that, okay, in addition to the climate change, let's overlap on this, the population density of the world. And what you find is a map like this, and it's sort of fuzzy, except I'll highlight what I think are population hotspots in climate change, and that is out here. You find that if you coincide the velocity of climate change and people, the population density, you find places where people will be affected, a lot of people will be affected due to the speed of climate change. And you find, sub-Saharan Africa, and this is things like water, agriculture, food, and et cetera, and livestock, they will be changed. Disease. So you have sub-Saharan Africa, you got this Iraq region out here, the Indo-Gangetic Plain, places in China, northern part of, in the upper north of Korea, some parts of Eastern Europe, and somehow Chicago. Now, I don't think Chicago is going to be that badly affected, but there are places, I wish I could overlay the income level out here. And if you do that, you'll find that sub-Saharan Africa, these regions out here, are going to be not only affected by climate change in a very fast way, but they don't have the access because they don't have the income levels to be able to do much about it. And that is an issue which we are sort of walking into. So we could use coal in the way, if we do it today, the way we are doing it, we could reach this problem in the future. On the other hand, well, this is a problem, there's also an opportunity. So let's talk about the population, since we're talking globally. We can see where the United States is, where the population. Here is the rest of the world. You can see the population density in China, in Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, et cetera. And if you look at where the energy is being used, you see a map like this. And this is a reflection of what the energy use is. It's a satellite image of the world at night and stitched together. What is interesting, is intriguing, is if you overlay the two again. And what you find is energy use and population do not correlate. And the United States is bright, and we need to make it brighter in a sustainable way. But there are many parts of the world where people have not yet turned on the lights. And as their income levels go up, they want to turn on the lights like anyone would. And that offers perhaps the biggest economic opportunity for the United States in the 21st century. Because the technologies that are required to enable them to turn on the right kind of lights in an affordable way do not exist today. Not all of them. The question is, what can we do? Can we grab this opportunity? So you got an environmental issue, you got a national security issue, you got an economic opportunity. It's all going on in parallel. So if you step back for a moment, and I'm going to be a little philosophical out here of what I think is going on and why I think there's a paradigm change that needs to happen, perhaps is happening, is the following. The biggest question of the 21st century is how do we grow in a sustainable way? What do I mean by that? Well, we know, I just told you that our population is growing. We just reached 7 billion people around the world, and we're going to almost double that by the end of the century. So the population is growing. There's really not much we could do except for education. Okay? Our economies are growing. That's a good news. Economies are growing around the world. People are getting access to wealth. Their lifestyle, the human development index is going up. That's a good thing. So you got two growths going on. The population going on, and per capita income levels are going up. Now the question is, how do we sustain this? Well, I look at it as an engineer. And one can argue whether that's the right way to do it or not, but I'm an engineer. This is a system. There's some input and there's some output. Here's the input. If you want to sustain a population growth and with economic growth, more use of stuff, you will need access to energy, food, water, and material resources. And I think the access constraints, the constraints to the access will be an issue in this century, whether it's oil or food or other things, or water for that matter. So that's the input side, and people call it, this is the national security issue, or access is, all kinds of other issues. On the other hand, you have the output, which is the emissions and waste, which if you do not constrain, we have a problem, okay? So it's the same problem. People look at different aspects and call it a national security issue or an environmental risk issue, okay? But this is the paradigm of how the world is running today. And this one-way traffic, frankly, in the long run, is unsustainable. The question is how to turn that around. And no one has really figured out how to do this way, which in the long run is the sustainable way. And now, some would say, hey, Arun, you're violating the second law of thermodynamics because you've got a perpetual motion machine out here, which is true. You have, for the energy part of it, if you're taking hydrocarbons and burning it, you get carbon dioxide, that's the lowest free energy level. You got to do something to turn that around. Absolutely true. So you need access to energy. But if it's part of the energy, part of this loop, it doesn't quite help. So you got to be out of this loop. And that out of this loop is a waste-free energy, okay, whether it's solar or other approaches, which is affordable and accessible around the world. And that we have not quite figured out, that access to waste-free energy that is out of this loop that will enable the sustainability. That we have not figured out. And so we need some game changes, because this game of one-way traffic has to change if we are to, grow in population and economy. So the question is, what is a game changer? And have we ever, let me try to describe in historical perspective when the game really changed. And so let me explain this. History. What is a game changer? And around the turn of the century, 1999 or 2000, a lot of people were worried about Y2K. Remember Y2K problem? I use a Mac, so I didn't have to worry about that. So I said, okay, let me do some reading. And I was curious, what's the most important invention and discovery or innovation in technology of the 20th century? And I thought, oh, maybe it's computers, the internet, or maybe space exploration. And I started reading, and what I found was absolutely intriguing. I could not believe, because I was not well educated. And so this is where people thought was probably the most important innovation of the 20th century. And let me describe. The history goes back to 1898. And there was a calling upon science to save the world from impending starvation. Sir William Crookes, the president of British Association for the Advancement of Science, who was a physicist, and he used to work with Tesla to make polyphase motors, et cetera. And he did a calculation that the water quality in Europe was improving, and the population was going up, and there's not enough nutrition in the soil to be able to feed this growing population. So he put up a challenge for the chemists to do something about it. But going back in history, this was known, so what people were doing that time is the naturally occurring fertilizers were coming from South America in something called guano islands. Now, I don't know Spanish, but what I'm told, guano is bird poop. And bird poop is very rich in phosphorus and nitrates. And there were the birds pooped a lot in South America in the migration, and there were the mountains out there. So there was a resource which allowed people to grow food. And at that time, there was a mad rush from Europe and the United States to go to those guano islands and dig up guano and take it all over the world. Okay? And there were conflicts between Chile, Bolivia, Peru, et cetera, and also wars between them, and conflicts between England, France, and Spain. And there was a competition who had the fastest ships. And so there was by the way, United States Congress passed a Guano Island Act of 1856, which basically said that any American goes into a Pacific island, if it occupies it, that becomes America. Okay? And they were all in the search of guano because that guano not only fed the Americans during the Civil War, but all the nitrates provided ammunition. Okay? So this was the history. This was a mad rush going on. And after a while, the guano just got over. And they said, what the heck do we do? So by a stroke of luck, there were some natural nitrate crystals. The whole, big, fields of that found in Chile called Chilean saltpeter. And so then there was a mad rush for the Chilean saltpeter for these natural crystals to act as fertilizers. But what William Crookes did was he did the back of the envelope calculation and found that even if that were true, even if you could use that, after a while this natural resource is going to go away. Then what do we do? And so that's when he challenged the chemists, figure this out. And in 10 years, a young, new kid on the block called Fritz Haber, chemist, discovered a catalyst to combine atmospheric nitrogen. This is a really hard problem because nitrogen has a triple bond. To break that is very hard, but he was able to do that nitrogen with hydrogen to form ammonia, which became the precursor for artificial fertilizers. And the catalyst was uranium, the first one. But this science is not enough. And there was a mad rush, by the way. A lot of Nobel laureates in chemistry were going after it, Oswald, et cetera, and they lost out to this kid. And within 5 years, Carl Bosch worked together with Haber at BASF to mass produce in an economical way. There were many other approaches that were not economical. He was able to mass produce the whole field of chemical engineering and high-pressure chemistry, all discovered at this time in Germany. And that made, when it made fertilizers. Haber and Bosch got 2 sets of different Nobel Prizes. There's an absolutely spectacular book. And this winter break, if you get some time, read this book on alchemy of air. Why was this considered the most important innovation of the 20th century? Because the world population turned a corner because of this. And it touched humanity like nothing else. And most of us in this room would probably not be here if it was not for this. It changed the paradigm of how food is made. The question that we have to ask is that, what are the paradigm shifts in today's world of the one-way traffic? Can we turn that around in some way? And that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give you a few examples of what ARPA-E is trying to do. So what's the role of ARPA-E? Is to translate science into quantum leaps in energy technologies that are too risky for the private sector, but if successful, would create the foundation for entirely new industries. It's the equivalent of the TCP/IP, et cetera, or stealth technology that DARPA did for the energy. So I'm going to show you just a few examples. We are only 2 years old, and so I can only show you some approaches that we are taking. The results are yet to come. There are a few results that are happening that are absolutely spectacular, but only few. Transportation. Let's talk about oil. Today's approaches to make alternative fuels are what are called biofuels. And biofuels are all what are, essentially photosynthetic biofuels. What do I mean by that? Well, you got sunlight, the energy from sunlight, you got carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and you got water. And how this works is quite simple. You got plants, and the machinery in the plants can grab sunlight, take carbon dioxide and water, and fix carbon dioxide into something called carbohydrates or other things. And it can be done in sugarcane, or corn, or algae, or cellulose. And we have now figured out how to break this down and convert that to oil. That's how biofuels work, okay, in very simple terms. Now, what is important to know is that this photosynthetic process is not very efficient. The efficiency from sunlight to oil is less than 1%. There's a debate whether it's 0.2 or 0.5. I say it's less than 1. Right? And because of this efficiency, or lack of efficiency, because it's so dilute, you need land. If you want to scale this up, you will need land, you'll need water, you'll need fertilizers. Okay? And because it is so dilute, if you want to concentrate, it takes money to be able to collect everything and concentrate into a fuel. Which is why, if you look at the cost of this today, this is the total production cost in dollars per barrels of oil equivalent, and this is the millions of barrels of oil equivalent per day that can be produced. This is the price of oil, which keeps fluctuating between 80 and 100. Today is probably $90 a barrel. It's somewhere out here. And this is the production cost of OPEC Middle East oil. That's the margin you have, okay, in profit margins. This is corn ethanol without subsidies, okay? It's higher than the price, so you need subsidies to create a business, okay? In the long run, subsidies may not happen. So the question is, what do we do? This is Brazilian sugarcane ethanol, and that, by the way, it's getting to be compatible with deep water drilling. Remember Macondo, Deepwater Horizon? I can give you horror stories because I was right in the middle of that. But nevertheless, that's becoming cost compatible. Okay? But that's Brazilian sugarcane because they have a longer growing season, and you can grow more out there. So this is where we are, and what you really need is to do R&D to reduce these costs and bring them down. And that's R&D. But that is now what I would say evolutionary R&D. You need breakthroughs even in that, but it's trying to take the biomass and take it down and produce fuel and go down the cost curve. What we asked is, let's step back for a moment. All the plants that you saw, corn, sugarcane, were really not designed for energy. Okay, corn was, the way you see corn, the original corn that you have in Mexico, et cetera, was the little twig out here. And that has been genetically engineered to produce corn like that. But that was for food. Sugarcane was never designed for oil. It was designed for naturally occurring sugar juice, whatever. So we said that why don't we step back for a moment, and if you were to design plants from scratch, what would they look like to produce oil directly? Okay? And that is the program called PETRO. And we have some funky acronyms, by the way, and you'll see a few of those as I talk about it. This is corn in terms of energy density, gigajoules per hectare per year today. And Brazilian, because the longer growing season is about 160. So we said, how would you design a plant to get to 160 at $50 a barrel oil equivalent? If you could do that, it's a game changer. And today's plants don't do that. So let's design plants from scratch. And there are lots of ideas. Change the Kelvin-Benson cycle, change this, change that. Okay? There's one idea which it's amusing, so I'm going to share this with you, is to take algae, and algae can produce oil, and it actually produces oil very efficiently. The problem with algae is that it gets infected by other things, and you need water, it becomes expensive, and the algae does not, the ones that produce oil don't reproduce very fast. So what these guys decided to do was to take the metabolic pathway that is there for the oil-producing metabolic pathway and put that in something that grows on very poor soil, grows fast in poor soil, and that is tobacco. Okay? So now, if this is successful, we hope that it's successful, that tobacco leaves will produce oil directly. That's the idea. And we're just taking a shot at this. And if this works out, you'll give a new meaning to no smoking in a gas station. And if this really works out, the good news is that you've got big oil and big tobacco coming together and saving the world. I mean, you can't get better than this. Right? That's what would happen. But anyway, this is we just started this program. We'll see how that goes. There's a project on pine trees producing turpentine. If you increase the productivity of turpentine, that would be pretty good, because turpentine is a precursor for oil. So that's the kind of projects that we're looking at, a completely different way of doing business as opposed to the evolutionary way. We also said that maybe there are better ways than plants. There's a lot of biology that is not plant-related. You and I are biologists. We don't do photosynthesis. So we said, what is biology actually doing? Biology is taking energy, or a reducing equivalent in chemistry terms, and using that to make carbon-carbon bonds. And you cannot beat biology in the specificity of making carbon-carbon bonds. But in photosynthesis, the cycle that you use is something called the Kelvin-Benson cycle, after Melvin Kelvin. He got a Nobel Prize for it, Berkeley. Okay. But Kelvin-Benson cycle is very inefficient, which is why you get this 0.2% inefficiency, less than 1% efficiency, because there's an enzyme out there that gets destroyed by oxygen, rubisco. So we said, are there other ways of using biology to make carbon-carbon bonds? Because that's what biology is doing. And we created a program called electrofuels. And this is run by, these are all the people, my team, out there. So here's how it works. You take any reducing equivalent, could be direct electrons from either solar or nuclear, or hydrogen sulfide, which is a waste product of oil and gas, okay, or hydrogen, and take CO2, and use non-photosynthetic microbes that can be programmed that use non-Kelvin-Benson cycle. They do not use Kelvin-Benson, reverse Krebs cycle, all kinds of other cycles there that can be programmed. That some of these electrodes actually, some of these bugs live on electrodes, and they produce oil. And the idea is to produce oil. And it turns out that these cycles, or the mechanisms, are at least 10 times more efficient than the Kelvin-Benson cycle. And people thought this is now, extremophile community working with synthetic biology community, all coming together and said, can you produce oil? And people thought this is really hard, this is challenging, probably science fiction, never happened. We said, let's give it a shot. We created a program, funded about 15 teams, and lo and behold, in less than a year and a half, there's a team at OPX Biotech and NC State that produced the first vial of electrofuel, which is a biofuel without using sunlight, directly from electrons. There's a group at MIT that is producing oil in a slightly different way, producing oil from electricity directly. And there are 13 other groups that are trying to do this as well. UMass Amherst, there's another group out there. So this is, again, a start. We don't know whether it's going to scale or not, okay, but at least it's a start. Now we ask the question, what is the engineered system to be able to scale it in a cost-effective way? That's what we're going to get into in the next few years or so. Anyway, but this is a new approach of creating biofuels. In the transportation sector, while we can create biofuels, whether it's electrofuels or other kinds of plants, newly engineered plants, you still have to compete with oil in an open market. The question is, are there other ways of addressing or reducing a vulnerability, because oil is a challenge, in terms of national security, economic security. I see two other vectors. One is natural gas. We have found a lot of natural gas in the United States. We are the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. Okay, and the question is, how do we transition into transportation? I won't talk about that. The other vector, which is really strong, is electrification. And I don't have to tell you in Nashville about electric cars. But the challenge in electrification is the battery. The cost and the range, the energy density of the battery is just too low. So we created a program called BEAST, Batteries for Electrical Energy Storage for Transportation. And the idea is that instead of, today's Chevy Volt is made of lithium-ion batteries, and it's expensive and the range is only 40 miles. Or sometimes the way you drive it, it may be 35. The question we're asking is that, what battery should we go after? One approach is to incrementally improve the lithium-ion battery, which is fine. You could do that, and that needs to be done. The other is to go jump to that battery that'll make electric cars have a longer range and be lower cost, overall cost, than a gasoline-based cars. Because you can then sell that car without subsidies, and that's sustainable business. So the idea is that if you can go from St. Louis to Chicago, 300 miles on a single charge, and if you can do it in a car that is, overall life cycle cost is less than gasoline, that's the idea. That battery does not exist anywhere in the world. And we said, let's take a shot at that battery. And that battery has to be at least double the energy density of today's lithium-ion battery and 1/3 the cost. And that is a really hard problem if you are to create these batteries. Now, some of these have been tried before, but there's some new innovations that we saw. I said, maybe we should double down on this. And so here's a whole portfolio of approaches. All-electron battery that's been tried out at Stanford, lithium-ion flow battery, completely new architecture. It's coming out, Yetmin Chang's group at MIT, and he's the founder of A123. Now he's founded another company in trying to make a whole new architecture of lithium-ion batteries. A whole class of metal air batteries, whether zinc air, aluminum air, magnesium air, all kinds of metal air batteries, a huge deal. Lithium air battery, which is the holy grail in terms of energy density. And people thought this is a really hard problem. They've been trying it for a while, till they found a new material that has very high mobility for lithium, but does not allow water to get in, because lithium reacts with water. And that kind of innovation of a composite material has allowed this now to happen. And they're all going for this amazing success stories in this. I won't go into the details of this. But if one of them succeeds, it'll make the lithium-ion battery obsolete, just like the lithium-ion battery made the nickel metal hydride batteries obsolete. And that's what we're going after out here. And if it's successful, we hope, just like you have Intel inside your computers, we hope you have a BEAST inside in your car in the future. We'll see. Let's talk about stationary energy systems very quickly. Our grid is old. 42 is the average age of a transformer on the grid, which is 2 years more than its lifetime. Think about it. That's what we have on our grid today. There are many states that have what are called renewable portfolio standards and goals. They want to get to, like California has 33% renewables by 2020. It's a very hard goal, and it's expensive. And so the cost of electricity might go up. So we said that let's look at this whole challenge in the electricity sector and see whether we can reduce the cost and make things smarter. Okay? So here's what we are doing. Clean and inexpensive electricity so that it can scale without subsidies, because in the long run, subsidies just not going to work out. Why 5 cents a kilowatt hour? Because natural gas combined cycle today is the cheapest way to produce electricity at about 5 cents, 4 to 10 cents a kilowatt hour. We said, let's take 5 cents. Solar, on the other hand, is about 15 to 20 cents at the utility scale. And we are losing our competitive edge to other nations like China and others in solar technology. In mid-90s, we had 45% of the manufacturing volume of photovoltaics. Today, it's about 5 to 7%. And we invented the solar cell. We said we need to do something about it. So we created a program called Sunshot. Just like President Kennedy said in 1962, let's go and land safely on the moon and return to the Earth within this decade. The goal of the Sunshot program is not to land a man on the sun, but to reduce the cost of electricity from solar to 5 cents a kilowatt hour within this decade. And that includes not only the cost of the module, but the cost of the installation, all the permitting, everything, power electronics, all of it, and reduce it to the point that is cost competitive anywhere in the world with fossil fuel-based electricity. So that if we could do that, it provides options for our nation to be able to optimize. Same thing with wind. If you look at, this is who is running, this is for the whole Department of Energy, not just ARPA-E. Wind today is, onshore is actually fairly inexpensive, but offshore is about 25 to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. And the question is, can we reduce the offshore one to about 5 or 6 cents? Same thing with geothermal, reducing the cost of carbon capture and for coal to about 5 cents a kilowatt hour, and nuclear as well. This is what is going on in the electricity generation. But this electricity has to travel through the grid, and I talked about the power conversion problem. So we are doubling down on power electronics and electrical power systems, because we as a federal government have not funded electrical power systems for a long time. If you go around the EE departments and ask how many people are working on power, the number is very low, and they're almost retiring. Sorry if I insulted anyone out here. But it is a dying breed of people. And if you look at the utilities, there's a huge demographic issue where people who really understand electrical systems, they're going to retire. And we don't have the human capital to fill in that gap. So we're doubling down on this. So here's an example. If you look at a substation transformer today, it's about 10,000 pounds. It is almost the same device that Tesla invented. It's not that different. Okay, you need a crane to install it. We buy almost all of them from overseas, and there's a backlog for about 6 to 9 months. That's where we are, okay? We said instead of, now if you are to replace these transformers since they're 42, 45 years old, should we do the same as we have done in the past, or use this as an opportunity to do something better? And we said that maybe we could do better than what Tesla did in the 1890s. And so we created a program called ADEPT on power electronics. And this is just one example of taking, instead of operating at 60 hertz, which is how the grid operates, and the transformer operates at the same frequency, why not operate the transformer at 50 kilohertz, but you need some switches that can switch voltages and power at 50 kilohertz, and you need wide bandgap semiconductors. Silicon carbide is one of them, gallium nitride is another one. So this is switching 15 kilovolts and managing a megawatt of power at 50 kilohertz, and Cree is trying to go after it, and they actually made a transistor which is dropping 15 kilovolts, 20 kilovolts across a single transistor to switch it. And if you go to high frequency, everything shrinks because the inductor, everything shrinks then. And if you do that, this whole device is estimated to go down from 10,000 pounds to 100 pounds. You could possibly fit it in a suitcase and take it. Yes, you got to manage the heat and everything, but this is where the technology ought to be going, and that's where we are looking at this, and some pretty amazing innovation that is going on right now. Storage. Today, we have a program in storage. Today, the cheapest way to store electricity is pumping water up a dam called pumped hydro. It's about $100 to $200 a kilowatt hour. And we said that that can only happen in certain regions. I don't think we're going to build too many dams in the United States. And the question is, can we do it anywhere? And we decided to create a program to look at any technologies. It doesn't matter whether it's electrochemical or mechanical or other ways to make electrical storage that is scalable at the grid scale, that is gigawatt hour, storing a nuclear plant for an hour at $100 a kilowatt hour capex. And that has to, and this is an amazing technology coming out of MIT called liquid metal battery, essentially mixing two metals that can plate out and store electricity, and then you let them mix, electricity comes out. And this is essentially turning an aluminum manufacturing method into a battery, which is, I won't go into the detail, pretty amazing stuff coming out of there. On the network itself, on the electrical network, and if you look at, we created a program called Genie. This is, on telephony, it went from wired telephone networks to fiber optics, wireless, and internet that we all know. The question is, where will today's grid go? Let me explain how today's grid works on the transmission level. This is how it works. You've got all kinds of sources, some of them intermittent, some of them base load, like coal for power plants, electricity from nuclear, et cetera. You've got intermittent against solar or wind. And today we have fast ramping gas turbines that can balance the load from intermittent load of wind or solar. And possibly you'll have storage in the future if the cost comes down. And you have loads out here, mostly in buildings. 75% of the electricity goes into homes and commercial buildings. And if you turn on the switch, you turn on your light and you turn on the switch out here, somewhere out here, someone has to energize and provide power. And that power, by the way, goes anywhere. We have no control of how the electricity flows in the grid. It's like water down a slope. We cannot avoid certain transformers that are already there on the grid. And so we said, this is not what the internet looks like. The internet, if you take a package email, you will attach an IP address and you can route it wherever you want. You have routers. That's what Cisco makes, routers. We said that maybe we should think about the grid a little differently than the grid today out here, because you have, people talk about demand response. There is no supply response. You cannot turn on and off and balance out intermittent load and fossil energy and renewable energy. So we created this program on high voltage DC transmission, as well as electrical power routers that are cost effective. You can route power. And if you start routing power, this is a nonlinear problem soon for those people who are computer scientists and mathematicians. This is an NP-hard problem. You cannot solve it using a Turing machine. The question is, how do you manage it in the right way? And this is a lot of computer scientists now have gotten into this with control theorists and experimentalists trying to see how to manage this nonlinear NP-hard problem, which is not totally NP-hard. There is an opportunity out there in heuristic ways to manage to create what we call the grid operating system. The Unix for the grid does not exist. It does not operate in real time. It does in 1 hour, 5 minute look-ahead markets or phone calls. That's how it operates today. And so that is what is going on out here. Very quickly, air conditioning. We have a program out here. If you look at today's air conditioner, we are a factor of 10 away from theoretical limit. Whichever way you look at it, it's about a factor of 10. We said, why don't we put the target out here and some amazing stuff coming out, and just air conditioning, which hasn't changed much from the times of Carrier, who built the first air conditioner in the United States. Okay, that's where we are. And so now we can possibly take some quantum jumps in this. And this is some absorption chiller that is being developed at Georgia Tech, which is very fascinating. So what I'm trying to tell you, what ARPA-E does, and in terms of breakthrough, is the following. And I'll summarize it out here in this chart. I'll just walk you through it. If you look at any technology, you can plot it on a cost to performance ratio out here to scale in size or volume. In the energy business, cost and scale are really important. And if you plot it in way, any technology, whether it's lithium-ion batteries or air conditioners or biofuels, will go down what is called a learning curve. As you do more and more, the cost comes down, the performance improves. And Moore's law in electronics is a learning curve. Okay? So this is what we call the assured path. And many of the DOE applied energy programs are going down this assured path. Let's take lithium-ion, let's use science to figure out what the problems are, let's make it better. What ARPA-E, and this is technology innovation, goes into manufacturing and scaling, and you go into deployment. What ARPA-E is trying to do is to do this, is to create new learning curves that are risky to start with, and some of them may end in these crosses, which are, gosh, this doesn't work. Okay, that's fine. You learn from it and you go back again. But there is a chance that some of these approaches, whether it's a lithium-air battery or some other, have a shot in being disruptive and reducing the cost, but being disruptive in the best sense of the word. Because if we don't do it, someone else in the world might. And then we'll be heavily disrupted. And so that's what we're trying to do. But while we are in this innovation, it is really important to place this in the whole ecosystem of energy. And what is that ecosystem? Well, if you go up this way, you'll need more and more money. So the orders of magnitude are for these innovation projects. Each project is less than $10 million, a few $1 million. It'll take about 2 to 5 years, and that's about it. And you'll see a success or some partial success or a failure. But as you go down to manufacturing, pre-commercial to commercial to deployment, the amount of money that you need goes up orders of magnitude. And the time you need is going to be at least 10 to 20 years. So we should not kid ourselves. All the things that I showed you is not going to appear in your Nissan Leaf tomorrow. or anywhere close to home tomorrow in the next 5 years. It's going to take about 10 to 20 years, and it's going to take money. So access to capital, low cost, long-term, large-scale capital is an issue in the United States of America. And we have to fix that. But that's only part of the story. After you make all this, you've got to sell it to someone. The markets have to be created. There's an economic issue. So you create US markets, so business, consumers, or the government is a buyer of energy. The military is the biggest buyer, and we're working with them so that they become the first adopters. Or there's a global market. And there are things that you can do to create the market. CAFE standards, 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025 is a long-term signal to the auto industry. They have to go take innovations, in whether it's electrification or hybridization, and go towards that direction. And that sends a signal, which for the business sector is extremely important, long-term signal. We do not have that in the electricity sector. The president has proposed clean energy standards, 80% clean energy by 2035, but we do not have a legislation on that. There's a gap on there. So this is the ecosystem. So unless we create markets, if we don't do this, and if we don't provide the financing, these innovations will go somewhere else in the world, where the markets are there and growing, the financing is available, which is what is going on today. So we need to not just innovate. Innovation is not enough. We've got to fix the other things. So what I say in summary is the following. We need aligned innovations. And alignment in the innovations are multifold. Not just in science and technology, and we have the best scientific infrastructure in the world today, and we can innovate. I'm pretty confident of that. But that is not enough. We need to align the innovations with financing and markets and policy to do that, and with education and society. This alignment has to happen. Once they align, US is unbeatable. But I would say today, these vectors are not quite aligned. And I think if we can do that quickly, we will be in a much better shape. Let me end by saying that every year we have an Energy Innovation Summit to discuss these things and to showcase the technologies that ARPA-E funded, and also the technologies that ARPA-E could not fund because we just ran out of money. We want them to succeed as well. We bring in all the stakeholders. And this is going to happen in February 27th to 29th in Washington, D.C. I invite all of you to come and visit. There's going to be science and technology, but there'll be investment community, the business community, the policy, the members of Congress, and all that. And these are some of the speakers. Bill Gates, he's deeply interested in energy. From someone from Tennessee, Fred Smith, he's turning all his small delivery trucks and electrifying them, thus creating a demand for batteries, which will bring down the cost of batteries, which will help him in the long run. And he's going on a limb to do that, and because he really believes that's the right thing to do. And it's a business thing to do. Lee Scott, former CEO of Walmart, and he has transformed Walmart in one of the most sustainable businesses in terms of sustainability and energy efficiency and transportation. Ursula Burns, Chairman and CEO of Xerox, Susan Hockfield, President of MIT, and many more. So we're just starting to plan this right now. So I invite you all, and as I said, we'll showcase all the technologies. And this is all the stakeholders, the whole ecosystem, not just in science and technology, which is, I think, is really important to bring all of them together and have this discussion on various issues. So let me stop here. Thank you very much. I think I've taken more time than I should have.
We can probably take time allow a couple questions.
Let me ask you
Sure.
about following up on where you finished up with taking innovations, turning them into products. Part of the problem is access to money, but the money's there in a lot of ways. Kind of money you're talking about is like a % or so of what we spend on oil every year. So money would be there if the cultural things are right. And I'm wondering, do you see issues where things could be done better on the cultural side of handing off from research to product development and getting through the valley of death?
I think the cultural part, I don't know about the culture part because I'm not a scholar in culture. But this is a financing issue. The business community have to figure out how to get the right returns on investment in the energy sector. Okay? The ROI is extremely important. There are financing schemes that are used in other sectors for heavy industries, for large-scale infrastructure. Public capital markets, public markets, stocks and bonds have not been used for energy financing. It's mostly private equity, and private equity is high cost of capital. And so if we could use, if you could use a portfolio of approaches, a portfolio of projects, and have low cost of capital for that, and use the stock and bond market to do that, that would be feasible. But there are some tax policy changes that probably have to change for that. So that's the financing part. I don't know if you, yep.
You made the point that we have these targets for biofuels, for example, but you also showed us that OPEC can cut their profit and still undercut your targets. So we can't win if they can still be cheaper than what we're doing. How does that work?
Right. I mean, there's no question that OPEC can increase the production and reduce the cost, reduce the price of gasoline, and that can happen. But I think given the growth of demand that is going on in Asia, and the supply that is, yes, we are discovering more oil, but there are some limits of that, and there's a cost of production is an issue. I think the long-term trends suggest, and it's hard to predict how what's going to happen, but the long-term trend is the prices are not going to come down. Okay, the long term. Yes, you may have fluctuation where the production goes up. Okay, so it is really important to have options for the transportation sector instead of having just one fuel. And the options so that we are not vulnerable if something happens is to create alternatives with this electrification of biofuels, et cetera. And it's really providing that option. That's the role of the government, is to provide an option. Yeah. Yep.
You motivated clean energy, I think you called it waste-free energy, in a way that I had not seen so well explicated before, which was that it wasn't simply to enable us to continue our addiction with energy, but clean energy was needed to break the cycle of one-way train of waste. That you needed clean energy to feed into that system so that you could actually recycle things efficiently without creating waste in the cycle itself. I take it ARPA-E doesn't worry about that application of energy, but I think it's very important that we as a society worry about that application of energy, or you're simply going to get with all these clean energies something akin to the artificial fertilizer invention, where it enables us to grow unsustainably.
Right. I mean, in fact, some of the problems in energy and environment that we have is because of the population growth that was sort of came as a result of Haber-Bosch process. So, yeah, I mean, we can use technology to solve it. At least today, it seems like if you have the waste-free energy that I mentioned, at least you have the option of creating a sustainable way of doing things in the future. And you need to have energy from some outside the loop to do that. So that's what we're going after. I mean, it's hard to say exactly what's going to happen. I mean, we are just, again, our goal is to see, if we believe in that model, then the question is, can we make it affordable so that everyone has access to it? Everyone has sunlight, it's just that it's too expensive to use it, and electrical form. That's what we are really going after. And in the future, there are about 1.5 billion people who don't have access to electricity. And the question is, how will they get electrified? And data has shown that if you provide electricity, their human development and the quality of life improves, because they can participate in medical health and cell phones and all that in our ecosystem. So is it more economical to run the grid to those people, or is it allowing them to produce their own electricity and store it and use it where they are with their local resources? Probably the latter. Okay, we don't know, and we need to provide the option to see, and it's frankly a business opportunity. Yep.
At the beginning of your talk, you said, well, ARPA-E has been created. When DARPA was created as a response to the Sputnik, ARPA-E has been created as a response to the report that was created. There is a difference, right? I mean, DARPA, when the Sputnik was launched, think that the national psyche was kind of affected. And that was disruptive, not in terms of technology, but in terms of psyche, and the nation was willing to, to put its effort towards something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel the same type of urgency as far as energy is concerned. Is there something you think that's going to come from the outside that's going to focus the effort of the nation?
Well, as I said, I mean, I think I would say some of the most progressive thinking people on this that I have interacted with are from the Department of Defense. It is a national security issue. Yes, it is not in the sky that is beeping down that you could hear on the radio. That's what happened, and there was a threat out there. But it's one of the slowly growing threats. I wish I could give you a global scorecard of where the United States is in investments in energy, how much public R&D investments are going on as a percentage of GDP. The best the United States has done is number 3. In public energy R&D, for example, we are number 11 in the world. And so if you are to use this as an economic opportunity of making innovations out here, making them out here, and exporting worldwide, and enabling the rest of the world, just like we have done with information technology, biotechnology, genes, Hollywood, automobiles, we have done that. We enable the rest of the world. And that's why the 20th century is called the American century, because we innovated out here, enabled the rest of the world, and that was a business opportunity. The name of the game, I feel, in the 21st century is access to energy or food and other things. And if you can enable the rest of the world, that's our economic prosperity of the future. That's at risk if you don't innovate. That's the message, I think. But I agree with you. It is not at the same scale as, perhaps I was not here with Sputnik. I was not born. So I don't know how it was, but from what I understand, the sentiments at that time, yes, we are not at the same level of intensity. We ought to be.
Okay, given the time, pass to our program and soft program.
Yeah. Dr. Majumdar, a small token of thanks.
Oh, thank you
on
very
behalf
much.
of the School of Engineering, we are so grateful to you for coming and for sharing with us your vision for a secure American future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please join us now for a reception in Adams Atrium to honor Dr. Majumdar and to continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Let me put this out here.